In the name of God, holy and undivided Trinity. Amen. Please be seated. Just to remind you, my name is Jim Newman. I was, lastly, for 31 years, the rector of St. Bede's in Mar Vista. It's a little bit to the west of you, sort of suburban Venice. And this is the fourth time I've been with you, and I'll be with you next Sunday. I want to make several comments about the second reading and the gospel before I focus on the reading from Amos to end and its relevance today. I think several weeks ago, I focused more on Pauline epistles than those falsely attributed to Paul. There are so there are some that scholars know were written by Paul because of their style and the use of words and everything. And so we've just finished reading, where were we, Galatians? I think we were Galatians a couple weeks ago. That is a Pauline epistle. Colossians is probably an epistle that was written by Paul or by one of Paul's followers or one of Paul's students. And in the old days, it was not, in antiquity, it was not falsehood to say that it was by Paul, because it's continuing his teachings. Colossians, as I said, was likely written by a follower or a traveling companion, or maybe a later reflection on Paul's teachings. And it is, whatever it is a later piece and shows the depth of reflection lacking in Paul's authentic epistles. Also, Colossians sounds more like a general epistle. That is, a lot of Paul's epistles were, let's talk about this town, and let's talk about this town, and let's talk about this town, or what are your specific issues? Colossians doesn't do that. Colossians is a general teaching epistle. The first 5 verses of today's reading, the first paragraph in your bulletins, if you were looking at it in the Bible, it would be printed in verse, not in prose, because it is a hymn, that was either composed by the writer of the epistle, or it was a hymn that the writer picked up to use in this reading. And New Testament scholars believe, as I said, that this was an early hymn, and verse 18 sets out what Jesus is to the church. And I'm going to quote several times today from the source, The Message, which I like just to get another spin on what we're hearing. And Mark was marked earlier. Mark was marked. Mark 18, sorry. Mark 10. No. Luke, say Luke. Aha, I'm supposed to be looking at Colossians. There it is. So, verse 18, which is sort of a central theme in the reading, is really sets out who Jesus is, and it reads, "And when it comes to the church, he organizes and holds it together like a head does a body. He was supreme in the beginning, and leading the resurrection parade, he is supreme in the end. From beginning to end, he's there, towering far above everything and everyone." Jesus is the head of the body, the church. Jesus is the beginning. The word in Greek is arche. He is the beginning of the church. The prologue of John's Gospel says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. That's en arche, en hologos. En arche is beginning. Jesus is the beginning. Jesus is the firstborn from among the dead. That's the center of our proclamation, isn't it? That Jesus is the firstborn from among the dead. And because of all of that, Jesus has supremacy in all things, as it says, towering above everything and everyone. So that's the premise of the author of the epistle. This is a very creedal reading. It is like when we stand up after the sermon and say the Nicene Creed. And if you go back and look at those verses that you just read at the beginning, that we just read at the beginning of in the service at Colossians, we might as well break out singing, "The church's one foundation is Jesus Christ her Lord." I would have asked to change the hymn today, but that's not fair to organists when that strikes me on a Saturday to say that. Okay. Oops. Don't turn 2 pages at once. So, remember with regard to the gospel that several weeks ago I mentioned that as we were in chapter 9, Jesus and his disciples had been at the Mount of the Transfiguration, and he came down and they had some dialogue, and then he set his face toward Jerusalem. Anybody remember me talking about that? He set his face toward Jerusalem. And basically the rest of Luke's gospel till you get till Holy Week is this great section that is only found in Luke about Jesus' adventures with his disciples on the road to Jerusalem after Transfiguration. That point will be on the test, so I encourage you to remember that. Last week we heard about an empathetic and caring Samaritan, and I don't know what your preacher said about it, but let me just add, if he didn't, that to talk about a Samaritan at that point would have caused the ears of the Jews listening to this to burn, because Samaritans were hated enemies. And so Jesus, all of a sudden, the priest passed by and the Levite passed by, and then there was, and you think, well, a priest and a Levite, and now we'll have a teacher of the law. But no, Jesus says a Samaritan, and people just get whiplash. What? He said a Samaritan. What? He said a member of Al-Qaeda? What? He said, you can figure out the surprise in whatever culture you live in. But the rules, when Jesus tells a story, the rules and the roles are often reversed. And we need to look for how those rules and roles are being reversed. Today we hear about Jesus visiting a home where the rules and roles are again being turned around. And next week we will learn an important prayer and again some more rule and role reversals. Jesus now comes to, whose house is he in? Martha's. That's unusual in that culture. Why is it unusual to say it's Martha's house? Huh? It's a woman, yeah. You would have said this was the house of Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha. I mean, obviously the father isn't there. But in Luke's gospel, Lazarus isn't there either. Lazarus is not in the home with Mary and Martha, and Lazarus is not raised from the dead in Luke's gospel. Luke doesn't, and that's a pretty big deal, but Luke doesn't talk about that. This is the home of Martha and Mary. This is Martha's home, pardon me. Probably the older sister. So, I went ahead of all of my notes. I just don't hit the microphone. Anyway, in John's telling, Lazarus is the brother to Mary and Martha, and he would have welcomed Jesus in the home had he been there or in the story at all. Whatever, Martha welcomes Jesus, then he freely operates in this family space. And Martha is busy with hospitality, but Mary is sitting and listening to the teacher. Now, I have heard many sermons. I have heard many talks at women's retreats given by people, sometimes me, where we're talking about the difference between contemplation and activity. And I would imagine that some of you have heard those talks too. I don't think that's the issue here. Whatever, Martha welcomes Jesus, and she's busy, and Mary is sitting and listening to the teacher. Now listen to me here, because I'm going to say something that neither our ears or our attention catches. Mary, the contemplative sister, is acting like a man. She is sitting at the teacher's feet with the men. The rules and the role are being reversed yet again. She was learning from the master. She was overturning these rules and expectations, and Jesus said, "Go for it, Mary." Don't we say that when women are now on the ordination track? Go for it. Now to comment on Amos. It is filled with images, and all of the images it is filled with are not happy images. It's, I gave 3 weeks ago, I gave you an 8-point short history on Israel and Judah. Israel, remember, is southern or northern kingdom? Huh? No. I over J. I over J. Israel, that's the only way I ever remember it too, so don't. Israel is the northern kingdom, and it was on the north, it was bounded by a very aggressive empire called the Assyrians, not the Syrians, the Assyrians. And it's a very unstable border, and in fact, Assyria would conquer the northern kingdom in 722 BC. So this is really being written right before that happened. And there are images of death and horror in this gospel, in this reading. When the reading begins, we have the image of a basket of summer fruit, or as one of my professors said, overripe fruit. It's been sitting out waiting for people to eat it, and sort of like the peaches that you've got sitting in a basket, you don't look underneath and you go, oh my God, nope, not today. Or the apricots, nope, not today. That was last week's fruit, not today's. But there's a word play in Hebrew that we don't hear. And Jesus, in the Bible, those word plays often happen, and we need to at least have them called to our attention. In Hebrew, the words for summer fruit and end sound alike. The words for summer fruit and end sound alike. And you will notice that in the reading, it says, "What do you see? A basket of summer fruit. Then the Lord said to me, the end has come upon my people Israel." So the writer puts those two words right next to each other to catch the attention of the Hebrew hearer. Secondly, in chapter 7, and we heard this last week, so I know you know it already, we heard about a plumb line. What's a plumb line? Straight, so you put it on something to make sure the lines of the bricks are straight or whatever you're doing. I have never used a plumb line. I am going by what I've read others do with it. I think there is a plumb line in my tool chest, but I've never used it. And when you hear about a plumb line in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, it is a code word for the coming judgment. It's a code word for the coming judgment, and we hear it in Amos chapter 7, 2 Kings chapter 21, and Isaiah chapters 28 and 34. In verse 10, he says, "I will turn your religious feasts, I will turn your feasts into sad affairs. Your songs will be funeral songs." And all of the things being mentioned in today's reading from Amos are when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain, the new moon being a religious festival, so we can start cheating people again. That's what he says. We will make the ephah small and the shekel great and practice deceit with false balances and so forth and so on. He's talking about how can we get around the religious rules of the day to go back and cheat people. Earlier, in chapters 4 and 5, Amos even more strongly condemns false worship. He says, come along to Bethel and sin. Bethel and Gilgal are religious shrines. Come along to Bethel and sin, then to Gilgal and sin some more. Bring your sacrifices for morning worship. Every third day bring your tithe. Burn pure sacrifices, thank offerings, speak up, announce free will offerings. That's the sort of religious show you Israelites just love. Not a happy message. Further on in chapter 5, he says, seek me and live. Don't fool around at those shrines of Bethel. Don't waste time taking trips to Gilgal, and don't bother going down to Beersheba. Gilgal is here today and gone tomorrow, and Bethel is all show, no substance. Seek God and live. You don't want to end up with nothing to show for your life. If he said, don't fool around with those shrines in Govina, and don't waste time taking trips to, I'm not going to say you all, to Mar Vista, where I used to be. Don't go those places. Don't bother going down to the Cathedral Center. Gilgal is here today and gone tomorrow. It's not a happy message. One of the great concerns of the Old Testament prophets is false worship and the fact that the world rules do not touch the lives of the people. Get the religious festival done so we can go back and cheat people. Not a happy message. Again and again, God condemns false worship, worship without meaning, rigid, unchanging, unthinking, rote worship, things you can say but not know what you're saying. We have things that we can say, and when we've memorized certain parts of the prayer book, I should offer a change up and say, no, we're going to do this. And you go, what's he doing? What do we have to say? It's an ongoing issue for God's people, and even for Episcopalians, it's an ongoing issue because the way we worship changes. It has changed over the years. It's changed when society has changed. It's changed when it's been challenged to change. In the 17th and 18th century, Puritans condemned repetitive, meaningless worship. That's condemning the Anglicans, us, for repetitive, meaningless worship. If you followed the British Book of Common Prayer on what a full Sunday service was, and it's what we call the 1662 prayer book. If you follow the full service, which is morning prayer and litany and sermon and communion, you would say the Lord's Prayer 5 times. 5 times. Repetitive, meaningless worship, according to the Puritans. But we'll talk about the Lord's Prayer next week. I don't want to get off on that sidetrack now. I'll throw curveballs at you about that next Sunday. The first American prayer book was much like the British prayer book, although with some changes, but they were mostly theological and not style. And I brought, one of my areas of study in seminary was liturgy. So I brought 3 historic prayer books. This is a 1789 prayer book without its cover. You can see how the print was very inviting. If anybody want to come up here after the service and look at these, I will leave these up here. So that's the 1789 prayer book, and it had lots of issues, but the church was just getting organized and society was very agrarian and dispersed, and so it took 103 years for the church to revise that book in 1892. This, by the way, is the part of my sermon which my friend Dean calls Jim has switched from preaching into an inquirer's class lesson. That's okay. This is an 1892 prayer book. It was changed to reflect how the society was becoming much more urban. But many of if you followed the service today, you would say, well, that's a lot like the 1789 prayer book. Yes, but. You didn't, for example, with this prayer book, if you were doing an official full Sunday service, have to do morning prayer, litany, sermon, and communion. You could break them apart. People went, oh, thank God. Just 36 years later, the church again decided to revise the prayer book, and the process took, a number of years in that 36. They came out with a prayer book called the 1928 prayer book. Now, some of you, I dare say, were raised on the 1928 prayer book. Can I have any hands on that? I mean, I was. This is the prayer book when I came into the church when I was in Episcopal High School in Minnesota. And the language is wanteths and showeths and all of that, just the way we talk at home. And the world had changed so quickly that a mere 51 years later, in 1979, you have prayer books around you. Thank you. In 1979, I don't need it, but today I'm just showing and telling. The prayer book was revised, and those of you who were around may remember that there was quite a stir about that among some people and in some congregations. And indeed, some churches broke away because they wanted and needed to talk to God in a more archaic language. It's also the year that women's ordination passed, so I think the traditionalists blamed everything on that convention in Minneapolis in 1976, pardon me. That's a prayer book to be approved, has to be approved by two general conventions. So the 1979 prayer book was voted on in 1976, and then the final vote was in 1979, and they couldn't change one word or they'd have to wait another 3 years. I had an old retired priest in my congregation in Minnesota, where I was the rector in Northfield, Minnesota, who was ordained in 1923, John Rideout, wonderful man. And he said that he had never liked the new prayer book. And I went, oh my, we're gonna have a fight. And he said, no, I never liked that 28 book, it was just too wordy. I thought, John, I love you. Well, we are now 43 years past the 1979 prayer book. And it takes at least 10 to 12 years to create an updated prayer book. We learned that the last time. We actually started the revision process in 1950 to start studying the 28 book. And then there were trial services with green covers and zebra-colored covers, and some of those may be sitting in closets where you might come across one occasionally. And of course, like anything these days, as soon as you publish a book, it is out of date. As soon as you publish a book, it's like when you never make a fancy parish directory with lots of work and everything, because the day it comes out and everybody gets there, by the time everybody gets their copies, there's already so many things to update that it's out of date. That's just the way the world is. So this was brought up. A general convention just happened, by the way, if you weren't following this along everything else in the world. And general convention just happened, and the issue of prayer book revision came up, which causes everybody's guts to sort of scrunch up and go, what are we going to do? And the solution was brilliant. And I've had copies of this article put out on the table as you go out today. You can take the whole thing and read it. I'm just going to read you like 5 little selections from it. The bill, the resolution that is called A059, everything has a number to it. A059 would for the first time define the Book of Common Prayer as, quote, those liturgical forms and other texts authorized by the General Convention. In other words, liturgies that are not in the current prayer book, such as same-sex marriage rites and gender-expansive liturgies, could be elevated to prayer book status, whether they are replacing parts of the prayer book or standing on their own. What A059 is about, really, is acknowledging that common prayer is evolving. That's a quote by Bishop Jeff Lee, the Bishop of Milwaukee, chair of the House of Bishops Committee on Prayer Book Liturgy and Music. And it creates a framework for that evolution to happen, including the inclusion of a number of different rites in a curated collection. The cat is already out of the bag, Lee said. The idea of the prayer book evolving from a book bound and physically present in a pew to a curated collection of texts that lives online, that's already the case. It's already the case. Perhaps with different understandings of authorization, but we decided to do that when we first decided that you could cut and paste a PDF. When you print parts of the service in your bulletin, you are essentially home issuing a prayer book that may not exactly be like the one that was passed in 1979. Don't read all that, go to the next page. The Book of Common Prayer in this church is intended to be communal and devotional prayer enriched by our church's cultural, geographical, and linguistic contexts. The Book of Common Prayer shall contain both public worship and private devotion. The Book of Common Prayer, as now established or hereafter amended by the General Convention, shall be in use in all the dioceses of the church. And I'll end with a quote by somebody I think many of us know, Bishop Mary Glasspool, who used to be our suffragan and is now the assistant bishop in New York. Bishop Mary says, I think this resolution is brilliant. I'm amazed we're in this 4-day General Convention and somehow squeezing into that intensity has driven us deep. This is the best convention that I've been a part of in the 11 years that I've been bishop and coming to these meetings. So, in the back, read, mark, and inwardly digest. And just remember that like those people who Amos was writing about, who got stuck in ways and forms that couldn't change and adapt to the people and issues of the day, so we can get trapped in that, and the church is trying to not do that. And the church is trying to find a way for when Father Neil adds something to the liturgy, and he has, when I added something to the liturgy at St. Bede's from some not fully authorized text, we can do that in that curated set of approved readings. And you can go online and see what all of those are. That's in the resolution. I'm not going to read it to you. So, read, mark, and inwardly digest. Here endeth the Inquirer's class and the sermon, Amen. And do come up and look at these afterwards, because you may not have ever held a 1789 prayer book in your hands.